There's been a focus recently on some more sad deaths of Aboriginal people in custody. There have been 5 in recent weeks, recent months. We keep reading, though, that, of course, the death rate for Indigenous people in jail is lower, actually, than the death rate for non-Indigenous people who are incarcerated. The real problem is that so many Indigenous people go to jail, that the incarceration rates are so high. How do we fix this?
Well, I think for a long time our focus has been in the wrong direction in terms of attempting to address this particular issue. As I've mentioned many times before, the research is there that indicates that the number one reason why we have such high rates of incarceration of Indigenous Australians is due to the family violence issue. And if we don't address this issue head on, then we're not going to see a reduction in incarceration. And of course, we're not going to see a reduction in terms of deaths in custody. And I guess the other issue is that for people who die in custody that aren't Indigenous, this must just simply go unreported if that's the case. And of course, we know every single time there is an Indigenous death in custody.
Yeah, it's true. There is a focus on this. Even if someone dies from natural causes in custody, if they're Indigenous, it makes news, which is why it's important to point out that the incarceration rates are the key issue. They are so high. When you're talking about family and domestic violence, though, presumably you're suggesting, because of the risk to victims, that incarceration is what's required in those cases. You can't not incarcerate people who are physically harming others.
That's correct. And over 70% of those who are incarcerated for acts intended to cause harm, acts of violence committed toward family members. That's for both men and women. In the case of women, a lot of the time women retaliate against their abusers and they end up being incarcerated themselves for acting out violently. So if we were to tackle this situation properly once and for all, instead of attempting to change targets around incarceration levels and prevent people from going into incarceration in other ways, then, like I said, we'd see a huge reduction in incarceration levels. And that's where the focus has to be. The one thing that came out of the Royal Commission, which is largely ignored, is around the fact that in the final analysis it says, well, only Aboriginal people can, in the final analysis, assure their own future. I mean, that to me suggests that at some point we, as well as Indigenous Australians, need to take responsibility for the situation that we are currently faced with. It is our families and our communities that are faced with this, the violence within our own communities. It is our family members who are committing crimes as well. In my recent paper, we demonstrated the fact that for places which have a population of over 50% Indigenous people, then the crime rates in those places are twice the state or territory average. In some places, like in Tennant Creek, for example, it's 4 times the state average. And family violence, domestic violence, outstrips all other crimes. So I don't know why, many of our leaders and those arguing about, the fact that they're still trying to claim, even though the Royal Commission found no racism, systemic racism, they're still trying to claim that this is the problem. The real problem is the family violence epidemic.
Yeah, the real problem is not in the prison system, not in what happens in jails, but in preventing people ending up there. So I suppose when you're talking about ending this cycle of violence, you're looking at a range of things, from law enforcement down to education, employment, those basics that are falling by the wayside for too long.
That's right, and Don Weatherburn, who headed the bureau into the New South Wales Bureau into Criminology, also points out in much of his research that one of the greatest leading factors to a life of incarceration for anybody, whether they're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, is education. And if children are not gaining an education because their home lives are dysfunctional, well, then they are much more likely to end up in a life of crime. That's where we have to begin to sort this issue out, is preventing people from the time they are children from ending up in a life of crime. So that means protecting our children, for starters, which states and territories are failing to do. And we see that over and over again, because Indigenous children are discriminated against based on the colour of their skin, because they won't be removed from circumstances based on their heritage. You know, there's so many common sense ways of dealing with this issue, but for some reason, the ideological way of doing it, which has failed us for decades now, is not working. But still, those who have the power to do something about this seem not to want to acknowledge it.
Thanks for joining us again, Jacinta. Powerful stuff.
Thanks, Chris.
Jacinta Price there. I mean, you talk about social welfare networks. There's none stronger, of course, than the family. And essentially what Jacinta is saying, support families, enable families to function properly, and you solve a hell of a lot of problems in society.